Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series. It's very nice to see all of you. We have a global audience from North Carolina and from across the United States, and indeed from abroad, such as Slovenia, the UK, Germany, Australia as well, and also some other countries. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at UNC Chapel Hill. I've run the Krasno Global Affairs series since 2012, and our point is to bring some much needed sober thinking and analysis to global affairs. We want to avoid the overly emotional and vulgar debate which has become all too common today. We are non-partisan, of course. Today, our guest is the Honorable Professor Gareth Evans. I will introduce our guest in a minute. Thank you, Gareth Evans, for joining us from Melbourne today. In Melbourne, it's something like 9:30 in the morning, I believe, and it's over 40 degrees Celsius, so really hot. How are you doing?
Sweating, but I think I'd almost prefer to be in a snowstorm. But anyway, it's fine. Air conditioning is regarded as one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century by Lee Kuan Yew, and I think that's the solution to all our problems for these encounters. So anyway, I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you, Klaus.
Thank you, Gareth. We are expecting more snow in a few days' time. Today, we will talk about navigating between the giants in a world under stress, dealing with the United States, China, and Russia in the Indo-Pacific, Ukraine, and elsewhere. I would like to encourage our audience to submit questions via the chat function of your Zoom screen. Our two Krasno assistants today, Sloan and Jack, will select them and read them out to all of us. After our initial conversation, Gareth will be happy to answer your many questions, I hope. Let me introduce Gareth Evans to you briefly. His CV is so long and so impressive that it's really difficult to cover everything. Let me try. Gareth Evans is now a distinguished honorary professor at the Australian National University. He was a cabinet minister throughout the Hawke and Keating Labour Party governments in Australia from 1983 to 1996. He held the posts of Attorney General, Minister for Resources and Energy, Minister for Transport and Communications, and he was Foreign Minister. As Foreign Minister from 1988 to 1996, Gareth Evans played central roles in the Cambodian peace process, the creation of APEC, and the ASEAN Regional Forum. He also was influential in bringing to conclusion the Chemical Weapons Convention. After leaving politics, Gareth was president of the Brussels-based International Crisis Group from 2000 to 2009. And subsequently, he was Chancellor of the Australian National University from 2010 to 2019. In addition, and there are many additions, in 2001, Gareth co-chaired the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, which initiated the Responsibility to Protect concept. He also co-chaired the Australia-Japan International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament in 2009. Gareth Evans has also written or edited 14 books, including Good International Citizenship, The Case for Decency, Incorrigible Optimist, a political memoir which came out in 2017, and The Responsibility to Protect, Ending Mass Atrocity Crimes Once and for All. Gareth and I met at a conference in Beijing last year, and he readily agreed to join us on the Krasno Global Events series. And thank you, Gareth, for finding the time to join us today. Let me ask you straight away. Your memoirs of 2017 have the interesting title of Incorrigible Optimist. When you look at the world situation today, not least at US foreign policy, is there anything which makes you optimistic still?
Well, not very much. It's a very depressing environment, and my optimism is a lot more corrigible than it was just a few years ago. When I think back at the time when I was most active in the 1990s as foreign minister and the early 2000s as head of the International Crisis Group, there was a genuine cause for optimism in the state of international affairs. Just that sense post-Cold War of the possibility for cooperation, the possibility of effectively addressing global and regional public goods issues, the possibility of addressing difficult security issues without the constant threat of superpower or permanent five vetoes. The Security Council was functioning, weapons of mass destruction, arms control was functioning with nuclear treaties, the Chemical Weapons Convention you've already mentioned. There was an effective collective response to the horror of 9/11. There was massive economic globalization, trade increases, reduction in poverty associated with that, and the formation of all sorts of dialogue mechanisms, the G20, the G8, APEC, and so on, which gave us confidence or optimism that all these things were not just transitory and temporary, but that we were really building an institutional future that was going to be sane and secure for most of the world. Well, looking back now in the current environment in the mid-20s, it's a very, very different situation. There's been a resurgence of deadly conflict in too many places, mass atrocity crimes being perpetrated too often. There's the flagrant charter breaches of the UN with Ukraine in particular, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's been the general impotence that's been so visible in the UN itself, with the paralysis of the Security Council. Complete collapse of confidence in international rules-based order, so well articulated by Canadian Prime Minister Carney just last week or so. WTO under assault, free trade under assault, nuclear arms control agreements dead, dying, or on life support, and a general collapse of decency in the conduct of international affairs. Some of this has been brewing for a few years now, and not all of it is attributable to the current Trump presidency, but I'll come to that in a second. I think there was a degree of problematic United States behavior in the early post-Cold War years, a degree of triumphalism which was misplaced, some overreach in terms of NATO expansion and so on. It doesn't justify, but it certainly helps explain the Russian neurosis that's subsequently been so visible. There's a long US history through that period of congressional refusal to ratify international treaties, so contributing to a decline of confidence, I guess, in the potential effectiveness of international law. The invasion of Iraq, of course, was a spectacular own goal by the US and the West. So much has just gone wrong. But above all now, what's thrown the world into more disarray than I think any of us can recall in our adult lives has been the elevation of Trump again, the second Trump presidency. There was plenty of wrecking potential evident in the first Trump presidency, especially over Iran and the tearing up of the JCPOA, the joint proposal for nuclear arms control, which was at least holding the line against Iranian nuclear weapons acquisition. But this term, we've seen Trump, I'm afraid, and this is a worldwide reaction, not just an Australian reaction, not just a personal reaction from me. We've seen Trump totally out of control on multiple fronts. An international policy which seems to be almost entirely ego-driven, me first rather than even American first, as Tom Friedman put it in an article just a few days ago. Zero respect for international law, zero respect for multilateral institutions, not least the United Nations. Zero respect for allies and partners, treating us all as encumbrances rather than assets. Zero understanding of international economics and the basic principles of international trade and the utility of free trade. Zero understanding of or indifference to the existential risks now obviously posed by climate change. And really also zero decency, most manifest, I guess, in the destruction of USAID and all that's gone with it. And with that, I mean, I think the very visible destruction of US soft power. So there's all sorts of things we can say about how to respond to all of this. But if you're asking me for a snapshot description of the current state of the universe, and whether it's possible to be very optimistic given all that I've described. I have to say that optimism is in pretty short supply. If there is any ray of light, I guess, it is in the kind of strategy that was so effectively articulated by Mark Carney at the World Economic Forum in Davos just the last week, when he describes in graphic terms the breakdown in any credibility to the concept of international rules-based order, but also describes the potential for effective pushback against that, in particular if the middle powers can mobilize themselves and engage in cooperative strategies and diversification away from super reliance on a very unreliable security partner, an economic partner these days. There's some hope for the future, but it's going to be a long haul, and it's a very, very difficult environment, certainly the most difficult that I've experienced in my whole adult public policy life.
Yeah, thank you very much. You have certainly depressed us all even more than we were already gloomy about the current world situation. So do you believe that is actually the new rule, or is that transitionary? Because Trump will have to leave at some stage, will his successors not find some way back to normalcy?
Well, if the successor is J.D. Vance, I mean, God help us, Tiny Tim. Look at what Vance said at the Munich Security Conference last year. Look at the way in which Vance positions on European civilization and the contribution of Europe to international decency, and just the contemptuous dismissal of that, which is now repeated in the national security strategy, which has just been recently published by the US. And there's just no sign of any kind of return to what most of us would think of as US values-driven commitment to global decency. Rubio, if he's the successor on the Republican side, and if it's a new Republican administration, I mean, he's just shown himself to be an empty opportunist without any, I mean, traditional China hawk, but without any particular credibility in the way in which he's been going along with all the horrors that have been perpetrated by the president. And on the Democrat side, well, we just haven't seen an emergence of the kind of effective counter leadership that would give us confidence that there can be some return to the US playing the kind of role the rest of the world really wants it to play, and the stabilizing role and the economic contribution that is so much part of the traditional balancing, stabilizing role that the US has played.
Yeah,
Whether that's possible to recover any of that ground in the short term, I don't think it's going to be possible at all if there's another Republican administration with any of the leadership I've described, and it's going to be a very hard road back, even if there is a fundamental rejection of that course and an attempt to re-establish some kind of credibility of the kind that we've been familiar with for so many decades.
Let me play a devil's advocate. Could it be true that Trump has a point when he says the United States got exploited economically, trade-wise for many years, and that the world relied too much on the United States as being the international policeman and was given all that responsibility, and everyone else basically passively relied on the United States? Does he have a point or not at all?
Well, you've got to separate out the economics and the security dimensions of that comment. On the economic side, I think there's no question but that the United States has been an extreme beneficiary of the kind of order that existed in the past, the commitment to international free trade. Lots of other countries have been beneficiaries too, but I think it's absolute and palpable nonsense to suggest that US has somehow been ripped off and is legitimately restoring the balance with its tariff policy. It just doesn't stand up to any kind of economic analysis. And, if anything, Trump is just going overboard in the other direction in a way that's putting at risk the global reliance on the dollar as the reserve currency. It's in so many ways, it's just, putting at risk not only the global interest, but US's own interests. In security terms, of course, there's a point to be made about others being less assiduous in meeting their own obligations to contribute to common security. The Europeans were underdone, clearly, in terms of the proportion of GDP that they were devoting to defence. Europe's a very rich combination of countries with significant more economic clout jointly than Russia, and certainly plenty of capability over time to match Russia's potential military threat to them, but it's got to spend more, it's got to be more active, and it's some of the laggards in the European system, do have to step up and make more of a contribution. But that's been a refrain of successive US administrations going back well before Trump. Trump's behaviour has concentrated minds, much more obviously in the last couple of years. But that's no justification for what we've seen, from Trump in terms of, the whole approach that he's adopted towards security issues has been one of, profound indifference to the issues that allies have felt about their own security. It's been contemptuous dismissal of the contributions that various allies have made to the United States' own security. I mean, the contemptuous dismissal of the contribution we all made to the Afghanistan pushback to 9/11. Was just, frankly disgusting. When my country lost 40-odd troops in frontline activity with 40,000 participants, UK and others, many more, for that just to be dismissed as a contribution of zero utility or zero contribution to the United States' own interest is just so. I mean, yes, of course, there's something to be said for putting the heat on the allies to do more in terms of their own contribution to our common security, yes, but I don't think any of that justifies the way in which that has been done and the broader implications of US security policy under Trump, which is far too permissive of autocrats and dictators and not putting the priorities where, frankly, they should be if we're going to have a safe and sane and secure world for the future.
By undermining the transatlantic alliance and NATO, by being or having strained relations with allies everywhere, including Japan and South Korea and Australia, and then also by damaging the credibility and image of the United States. Doesn't Trump do harm to his own country? And doesn't he recognize that? Why would he do
Well, of course it does. I mean, soft power means something. It's not just the hard power dimensions of this. It's the reputational advantage that comes from being seen to be a decent country that is not just looking at the world totally through your own national security and economic interest, but does have some sense of common responsibility for peacemaking, for peacekeeping, for development, for poverty reduction, for addressing those big global and regional public goods issues, which can't be resolved by any country acting alone, but do require, cooperative strategies to deal with. There are huge reputational advantages that flow from being seen to be what I've described as a good international citizen. And when you throw all that away on the altar of complete self-interest or complete ego-driven interest in the case of Trump, you really are losing the potential for a lot of support. I mean, it's already showing up in tourist figures. People are not wanting to come to the United States voluntarily. It's showing up in the sort of the move away from the US as a reserve currency. That's going to take a very long time, but that's manifestly not in the United States' interest. And that's a function of just general unhappiness, uncertainty about the role that the US is playing. And you can adopt this approach of Western Hemisphere first and restoration of the Monroe Doctrine taken to infinite new dimensions. But none of this is going to, I think, serve the United States as longer-term interests in the way that a serious commitment to international credibility, decency on all these fronts we've been talking about would otherwise have done. It's a huge abandonment of credibility. And it's something that I know Americans like yourself and half the population or more is seriously worried about. But I don't think we can understate the degree of difficulty that America is now getting itself into if this kind of behavior is sustained for any longer term period.
Doesn't Trump recognize that, or at least doesn't Rubio, Vance, and the Treasury Secretary and various other cabinet politicians, don't they recognize that?
Well, you're in a better position to judge that than I am. I mean, some of them obviously are intelligent enough to recognize it, but have abandoned their intelligence in the interests of sycophancy and opportunism, with Vance, I think, being exhibit number one in that respect, and Rubio being exhibit number two. There's no question about their intelligence, and I'm sure no question about their understanding of these dynamics, but their indifference to it and is just pretty breathtaking. And what's even more breathtaking to us and the rest of the world watching you, and must be to you too, is just the subservience of the other institutions in the US system that are so critical to give checks and balances. I mean, the first Trump administration, there were all sorts of adults in the room, both internally in the administration and the other institutions that were playing their part. But the adults in the room have gone missing. The Supreme Court may recover some credibility with its judgment on the tariffs issue, which is looming. They must, even the most extreme of the Trumpian appointments, must be beginning to wonder what the hell their responsibilities are in dealing with this. But I mean, the Congress has been most appalling. I mean, I remember so well dealing with people like Richard Lugar and other people like George Shultz and so on. I mean, Republican and Jim Baker, my counterpart as Foreign Secretary. These were people with a different view of the world than I started with, but people of basic integrity, basic intelligence, basic decency, and that stream of contribution to public policy just seems to be missing. And unless the courts and the Congress start behaving in a way that I know many Americans want them to, and the rest of the world certainly wants them to, then it's not a happy picture that we're looking for.
You mentioned the middle powers. Do the middle powers really have the possibility to push back? We could say, yes, look at Greenland, where Trump climbed down, but is there not rather an exception that in economic terms, in particular, in trade terms, the rest of the world, perhaps with the exception of China, is entirely dependent on trading with the United States, and Trump is exploiting that?
I think Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, did articulate very well what not only the responsibility but the role of middle powers is in pushing back. And remember, what we're talking about here as middle powers is basically let's just talk about middle powers for a second, because it's a difficult concept to get your head around, and it means so many different things to so many different people. But basically, middle powers are those countries without the military or the economic clout to be able to impose their preferences on anyone else. But nonetheless, they're bigger than just the small players in the system because they have the capacity, they have the credibility, and by definition, I think they have the motivation to make a difference in the world as players rather than just sort of bystanders or prisoners of larger currents. Defined that way, it's very difficult just to use criteria of population or GDP or whatever. It's a matter of looking at levels of activity and motivation and commitment, as well as just raw size. I mean, countries like Norway and some of the Scandinavians are not very large in population terms, but nonetheless sort of punch way above their weight in terms of their contribution to building international coalitions around big, public goods issues. And that, I think, is the point. If the middle powers do get their act together, and don't behave in a way that they're just going out on a limb, seeking favour, seeking separate deals with the US to preserve themselves, but rather join a common pushback in the way that the Europeans did so effectively, as you say, on Greenland, and do this in the context of WTO, restoration of institutional credibility, do it in the context of the climate change exercise, do it in the context of weapons of mass destruction issues, then I think the middle powers can actually make a difference. An awful lot of the big sort of policy achievements of those early post-Cold War years in the 90s and the early 2000s were the product of very active middle power engagement, cooperation, the big international trade rounds, developing really strong support for free trade movement, the big movements on arms control, big movements on just so many on peacemaking, the kind of contribution that middle powers made to some of the most intractable peace and security problems of the 90s and early 2000s needs to be remembered and recognised. The contribution, for example, Australia made with Indonesia in bringing peace to Cambodia. We didn't succeed in bringing human rights and democracy. That's another story for another day. But we certainly succeeded in bringing peace just by mobilising through energy and creativity and a willingness to find cooperative solutions to these problems. We mobilised an effective response. And I think the most visible, the most important playing field for the middle powers to play this role in the current environment is probably in climate change, the biggest existential risk of all that we face in the longer term. And serious cooperative behaviour by those can make a big counterweight difference to even the most obstructive and cantankerous behaviour by the United States.
Are you happy with the role of the European Union right now? How they deal with Trump? We all know in security terms, they are totally dependent on the United States still. And does that explain, is it a sufficiently good reason to really try to flatter Trump rather than mostly not push back against Trump? Could the European Union actually do more? Because one of the largest trading blocs in the world.
Yeah, I think the European Union has learned a big lesson over Greenland. I mean, the initial efforts to just sort of flatter Trump into submission were manifestly not bearing very much fruit at all. And the pushback over Greenland and the threat to use the bazooka mechanism, the Europeans' own potential for waging tariff warfare, did make a significant difference to Trump's behaviour. And I think that's the model for the future. And that's the kind of thing that, again, to refer to Carney's big speech in Davos that he was referring to. Yes, the Europeans need to do more in terms of contribution to defence and security. They do have the economic capability between them to make up really for the shortfall of American support. It's going to be a long while before the Europeans can act effectively, and this is true of Australia too, at the other end of the world, without American logistic support, intelligence support. I mean, the degree of enmeshment of our security systems in the NATO system and elsewhere with the United States has been really pretty profound, and it's very, very difficult, as we're realizing in Ukraine and elsewhere, very difficult to imagine an effective military response to a major kinetic threat without American support. But the writing, I think, is on the wall. Everybody is looking to increase their own self-reliance. The Europeans are doing it. Britain's now toying with, edging its way back into a formal association with the European Union, having realised that the idea of its special relationship with the United States is completely illusory. Australia is, rethinking fundamentally. I've never known the US alliance to be so much under critical attack and threat in my country. And all of us are looking for ways of diversifying our economies and increasing our self-reliance and developing security strategies that are far more attentive to the possibility of minilateral arrangements with others. I mean, we'll come back to Australia, I suppose, but in the context of the Asia-Pacific, I mean, everybody is looking for new ways of getting together and putting resources cumulatively together to meet potential threats in a way that is not as dependent as it has been in the past on the US role. So yes, the European Union, can do more, but I think is in the process of just that transition at the moment.
Are you surprised by Trump's policy towards China? When before Trump came to office during the election campaign, we expected a very hardline policy towards China. That doesn't seem to be the case. He's actually pursuing a pretty easygoing policy on China. There are some exceptions, but when you look at the latest national security strategy, China is not really mentioned as a particular threat to the United States. How do you explain that?
Well, I mean, Trump's reaction to China is all over the place. This government's reaction to China is all over the place. I mean, I always used to describe as having three obvious strands. One was the make America great again, America primacy being asserted, and an unwillingness to accommodate the notion of a rival to geopolitical, geostrategic, geoeconomic status. There was that dimension. There was the America First sort of dimension, the isolationist dimension, which involved a sort of a conceptual retreat from really taking on China and much more willingness to embrace this kind of every great power has its own sphere of influence and, let them do what they want to do while we do our thing in the Western Hemisphere. And that's resurged again very visibly in the national security strategy, obviously, of the US. And then there was the purely ego-driven, narcissistic, transactional dimension, which bore no relationship to either a sort of a US primacy or a US isolationist position. It was just purely a function of Trump's own ego and his sense of what the stage could bring him. Where we are now is it's just very difficult to articulate. Yes, Trump is demonstrating much more willingness to be accommodating, to continue to have a strongly economically competitive relationship with China and be pushing as hard as he possibly can on that front, but to retreat from any serious contestation on the security side. Complete sort of all over the place ambiguity and uncertainty in terms of what the hell they're going to do about Taiwan. I mean, we can talk about Taiwan in more detail, I guess, in a moment, but Trump's position on Taiwan has been absolutely all over the place. I mean, some of the time he's supporting building up Taiwanese defense capability with strong American support. Sometimes he's hinted at the unacceptability of the necessity for a very strong deterrent posture to be made, and keeping open the possibility of American military response to any attempted takeover kinetically of Taiwan. But then, other times he's making pretty clear that he's not very interested at all in acting to protect Taiwan. So, I mean, it's just very, very difficult to read all of this at the moment. I mean, the only ground for optimism, I suppose, is that in this environment is that, I mean, Trump, for all his disposition to intervene militarily, which we've seen in Venezuela and a few other places in recent months, does not seem to be keen on embarking on a major war or getting America drawn into a major war. And his instincts are much more cautious than some of the traditional China hawks around him, and his willingness to sort of talk up the China threat is much less instinctively than a lot of other people in the defense and intelligence apparatus. And that's good news, and the possibility of some kind of global accommodation and recognition of the need for cooperative response on all these issues with China, rather than a nakedly confrontational response. That's good news, but it's impossible to be confident as to which one of these streams of instinct or other response will prevail. This is a mad world that we're inhabiting at the moment, and most of the madness is coming out of Washington, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I quite agree. Uh, Increasingly, there's talk about a so-called G2 world, a world divided up between the two superpowers, China and the United States. Even within Trump circles, I hear that that is being talked about. Do you think that is realistic, or is just some empty talk?
Well, the G2 concept is a bit ambiguous. If it's a recognition that there are two major superpowers in the world now, and that is true. There's China and US, and Russia is a very poor third, and India a fourth at the moment. But they are the two big guys. And if the notion is that talking about a G2 recognizes that reality and is a way of describing the imperative for those two to find an accommodation between them, which is not confrontational, but is cooperative and is willing to, sort of step back from the brink of competition becoming overt war. That's all to the good. But if the G2 concept is, as you put it a moment ago, dividing up the world more or less and being the decision makers for everybody else, with nobody else really getting a look in. This is not the way the world wants to go, and that's not the way that is going to generate any kind of peace or harmony or economic prosperity for the rest of the world. What we are desperately in need of is an approach to geopolitics which recognizes the utility of multilateralism, recognizes the utility of the rules-based order, has gone missing as that now has, which recognizes the utility of multilateral institutions like the UN and the WTO and so on, and which doesn't regard it as all a function of just great power accommodation with each other. So that's the G2 talk is potentially dangerous, but if it's a prelude to talking about the possibility of détente that we saw over a long period between the United States and the Soviet Union, then it is a way of contributing to a degree of stability that would not otherwise be the case. So I think the jury's a bit out on how we respond to that language.
Thank you. Kani was in Beijing recently. The Finnish Prime Minister was in Beijing. I think the UK Prime Minister Starmer is there right now. The German Chancellor is going in late February, and I'm sure the Australian Prime Minister Albanese will be there soon too, and many others. So does that indicate countries around the world have really given up on Trump? Instead of going to Washington, they increasingly go to China, that China is hugely benefiting from what is happening in US foreign policy, and that everyone else seems to be happy to look more towards China?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously Beijing is laughing all the way to the bank in terms of the collapse of credibility of the US under Trump, and the willingness of all sorts of countries to really bend over backwards to find some common grounds from China and some useful economic relationships and investment relationships and all the rest of it. I don't think that means that all of us, and Albanese, our Prime Minister, has already been to China in the last month of last year and had a very successful visit. I don't think it means that we fall over ourselves in kowtowing to China any more than we do ourselves any credit by kowtowing to Washington in its present mood. But it is a matter of sending a very clear message to the United States that we're not going to be spooked, any of us, into stepping away from commercial relationships, economic relationships, and potential, global public goods advancement relationships, which are in all our interest to pursue, simply because the United States is unhappy with that diversification strategy economically, and diversification in terms of not having all your security eggs in the US alliance basket, is the way of the future. And we're seeing it working out in real time with those visits you've just described.
Mm-hmm. Tell us, do you expect a conflict over Taiwan? And if there is such a conflict, will the United States interfere?
I don't really expect a conflict. I mean, I think there's a very interesting report by the Stimson group, Stimson Center, just middle of last year, which analysed very meticulously the risks that Beijing would confront if it turned its rhetoric into full-scale military activity. Risks of nuclear escalation, the conflict completely getting out of hand, domestic political risks if the enterprise was not immediately successful, and significant casualty rates and so on domestically. Economic risks of blowback from the rest of the world in terms of sanctions, but general disruption of trade at the very least that would follow from it. But also the operational risks, the nightmarish risks, even with a military that's on its way to becoming quite formidable, like China's is, the operational risks of a cross-border invasion, are very, very, very high, very, very difficult to put that sort of enterprise together. Yes, we're seeing a continuation of the rhetoric about China by 2027 being prepared to mount a military operation. But I think the smart money is very much at the moment on all of this being, a continuation of more rhetoric than substance. I mean, yes, there's lots of grey zone activity going on at the moment, lots of military posturing and flybys and all the rest of it, and there will be increasing emphasis on putting some economic heat on Taiwan. But I think the prospect any time, within the next decade of a military operation, are very, very remote, and have been wildly exaggerated by a lot of the people in the security and intelligence establishments and some of the press and Murdoch and others that have been baying them on. If China did do what I think is presently extremely unlikely and mount a military operation, I mean, it's very hard to know how US would respond, but my instinct would be that Trump would be very reluctant to to go down the path of embarking on a major direct operation in support of Taiwan, and certainly those of us in the rest of the world that are looking on to this would be extremely reluctant to join in any such enterprise. Not because we don't feel any sympathy or common cause with a flourishing democracy as Taiwan now is, but the whole thing is just nightmarish to contemplate in terms of the likely outcome of any such support, which I don't think would be very positive in terms of tipping the balance, and the downside risks that are involved. Moreover, for the rest of us, and this remains the case, that Taiwan is a very special case. It's not a Ukraine, it's not an Iraq. The rest of the world might not be willing to go all the way in saying it's part of China, but clearly the sovereignty issue there is one that's very, very different in kind than the sovereignty issues that are so visibly and obviously involved in Ukraine and were elsewhere with invasion. So I think China's ambitions beyond Taiwan, which is the other point that gets people exercised, is this just going to be the first step in a row of collapsing dominoes? I think that's wildly overstated. I mean, there's no doubt that China is determined ultimately, even if it takes another half century, to restore its complete control of Taiwan. But the notion that that's a prelude to some larger aggressive intent towards other countries in the region, I think is just wildly overstated. That's never been part of the Chinese repertoire. Yes, of course, Xinjiang. Yes, Tibet, of course. Yes, Taiwan, of course. But beyond that, that just hasn't been part of the Chinese rhetoric. That's just not part of the Chinese instinct, and it's not part of what's in China's interest to pursue. Moreover, there's one other thing, of course, that's currently exercising a lot of people's mind, and that is just how capable is the Chinese military at the moment with this decapitation of the senior leadership for corruption charges and so on. Yes, there's plenty of visible firepower there, but do they have the operational expertise and coherence within the PLA to be a really serious threat to anybody, or such that could give them confidence to mount an invasion of this kind? So it's a very complex issue, but I mean, my instinct on this is to just lower the temperature, give Taiwan as much support as it needs to have an effective, visible deterrence. The porcupine strategy, to have so many quills out there that it's a visible deterrent to China acting aggressively. Of course, discouraging Taiwan from going over the top and declaring independence, which would be something that China would be unable, I think, to ignore and would generate a kinetic response. We've got all those responsibilities, but beyond that, I think we should just, take a headache powder and just, lower the temperature.
Do you expect economic coercion on the part of China, an economic blockade, by trying to make the Chinese give in by economic means rather than an outscale invasion?
Well, I think, that's part of what we call grey zone operations, economic pressure and boycotts and all the rest of it. There's a degree of mutual dependence, still with China and Taiwan. There's a huge amount of economic activity going on between them. And it's easier said than done to apply economic pressure on Taiwan in a way that would be sufficient to bring them to the point of capitulation. And not be counterproductive to China's own interests. So I think we'll see a whole bunch of pressure points continuing to be applied against Taiwan. But at the end of the day, I think it's the status quo is maintainable indefinitely if everybody, maintains a pretty cool head. Look, just one more point I think needs to be made about Taiwan, and that is Taiwan, if it wants the rest of the world to leap to its support and to its defense, it's going to have to do more for its own defense. And we've got this incredible divisions in Taiwan internally, politically, with multiple attempts by the present government to increase the defence budget, being in fact defeated in the parliament. So Taiwan at the moment is only spending about 2.4% of GDP on its own defence, nothing like the 5% that the US is demanding of everybody else. And if the country is divided internally to that extent, then it adds yet another reason, I think, for the rest of us being unwilling to sacrifice blood and treasure in an enterprise that's, at the end of the day, such a cul-de-sac.
If you talk about Trump's big ego, I wonder, doesn't Xi Jinping also have a big ego? Doesn't he want to go down in Chinese history as the one who brought Taiwan back, so to speak?
Yeah, look, of course there's that instinct, but this is, he's doing no more in this respect than repeating language that's been around for the last, 2 or 3 decades. And yes, I know he would love to deliver that. And I think, the 49 anniversary is probably, more of a deadline than the 2700th anniversary of the party deadline. But I think it goes back to what I said at the outset of this little discussion. I mean, the risks involved for Xi in moving beyond a pressure campaign to an outright invasion campaign are really very, very strong. I mean, there's a risk of US involvement and escalation. He can't be confident that the US will stay out of this. There's the domestic political risk if it doesn't go well. I mean, if something, he must take some pause from Russia's experience in Ukraine. I mean, what was meant to be a 2-day cakewalk turned into a nightmare. I mean, Russia's still dealing with that and living with that and somehow shrugging it off. But that would be much harder for, I think, Xi to shrug off. And the economic consequences, the trade disruption at the very least, even if there's no massive international sanctions campaign, the trade disruptions and the domestic implications of that would be very, very serious for China and for Xi's own stature and standing. And then there's just the sheer military difficulty involved in mounting an invasion. You can have all the landing craft and all the rest of it and all the naval assets in the world, but you've still got to have a massive operation of physical engagement and supply and all the rest of it, and that's quite tough to do. And in a military that's very unproven in terms of its fighting capability. And I mean, the last time it went to war basically was the '79 Vietnamese enterprise, which did not end well. And with all these internal disruptions that are going on at the highest level within the PLA, I think we can all just sit back a bit and let nature take its course on this. But it is important the Taiwanese don't themselves do anything stupid like declaring independence. If they did, I think all hell would break loose and in ways that are completely unpredictable to foresee.
Yeah, thank you. Australia is sending a new ambassador to Washington. Kevin Rudd is retiring as ambassador early by a year. What happened?
Oh, well, I think Kevin Rudd, I mean, I haven't spoken to him personally, but I think he's pathetically grateful to be out at the front line, having dealt with considerable professional expertise with this impossible administration and having kept alive at least the notion of this crazy AUKUS submarine deal. Which I suspect is not going to be alive for very much longer. I think he probably thought it was a very good time to go back to that outstanding job offer that was back on the table as head of the Asia Society. The Korean incumbent of that role, who took over from him when he moved in the first place, has gone back into politics. The vacancy was there, so I think it's perfectly sensible. The notion that he's now being speculated that he's going to go and chase the UN Secretary Generalship, I think is misplaced. Look, Kevin Rudd is an outstandingly competent statesman. I mean, he's really one of the smartest people I've ever come across in my life. He knows China inside out. His instincts are a little bit more hawkish and black than mine, I think, on this subject. But I think he did an excellent job, and there's no particular mystery about why he left when he did.
I
And I
hear,
think.
I hear that Trump didn't like him, that was
Oh,
decided.
well, Trump didn't like him, but I mean, Trump doesn't like anybody very much but he's put up with, I mean, Rudd did no more than Rubio and others did in their linguistic assaults on Trump's morality and competence and everything else. They seem to have been somehow forgiven and ushered back into the Trumpian space look. That was not an issue for us. But what we have done in Australia is we've now appointed a career diplomat of some real competence and capability to the role. We've not succumbed to the notion of putting in place a political golfing partner for Trump in the hope that this would, suck up to his personal vanity and make life somehow easier for us. I think Australia has acted here in a very professional way, and I think we should be grateful for the job that Kevin Rudd was able to do in a very, very difficult period, but recognise the utility of now stepping back a bit and just having a more traditional diplomatic relationship as we all try to manage these unmanageable waters ahead.
Thank you. Can I remind our audience to submit their questions, and we will turn to these questions just in a minute. I just wanted to ask Gareth Evans about Russia and the Ukraine war, and of course, Western policy towards Russia and Ukraine. Is that much heralded peace process? Is that worth talking about as a peace process, or is it selling out?
Oh, it's a very, very unhappy situation, which has got no particular prospect of resolution that I can see in the short to medium term, maybe even the long term. We're familiar with conflicts that have been more or less frozen now for years, and I suspect the most we can hope for in the Ukraine situation is another one of those Georgian style, frozen conflicts, Moldova style, in which nobody concedes any ground to the other side but steps back from active conflict. There's plenty of incentive for Russia to do that in terms of the economic costs that it's bearing and the human costs that it's bearing. So far, they're staring that down. Whether Ukraine can continue to maintain its position depends above all else on European support, and so far that looks very strong and very continuing. American support has been all over the place. At least the material is flowing, if not the financial support, and if not the political support. But Trump is obviously no help at all to resolving this situation. His susceptibility to flattery by autocrats. The news today, I think, of the photo of Putin in the White House, along with his family photos, is a demonstration that something's fundamentally astray in his moral bearings. He just doesn't seem to give any weight or credibility to, the quite horrifying breach of the rules that we've all been trying to live by internationally that was involved in that Russian invasion. And so long as the US stays in this sort of ambiguous position, I think the hope of putting any kind of really, really significant pressure on Russia to reach not just a ceasefire, but some sort of political settlement of this is a pretty quixotic aspiration. It's just a very, very tough one to resolve, and I suspect that, as I said, the most we can hope for is that exhaustion will set in sooner or later for Russia, and that we'll move into frozen conflict territory. But that's not very satisfactory.
Thanks. The Western world is, of course, also quite divided about the Ukraine war, increasingly also in Europe. Did Putin need to defend himself? Was the NATO expansion towards the east provocative? So did Putin have a point? That is discussed by many people. How would you react to that?
Well, I think it's a nonsense. Yes, of course, NATO did overreach in that original expansion activity that took place, back under the Clinton administration, and my friend Strobe Talbot and all the rest of it. They just failed to observe the utility of Jim Baker's warning commitment that the expansion would only go so far. I think the biggest problem with the NATO expansion was not so much that it went up to Russia's border, but it didn't include Russia. There was a possibility in those very early post-Cold War years to have a complete reconceptualization of what the common security of the area was all about, and the notion that Russia could in fact have become part of NATO and a combined operation. That opportunity was lost. But the notion that the NATO expansion that did occur, involving the Baltic states and Poland and so on, was somehow an existential threat to Russia, is so comprehensively misplaced and so comprehensively overstated that it just doesn't deserve to be taken seriously. Yes, it is being taken seriously by some of the European autocrats like Orban in Hungary and so on. They're still talking that talk, and that's making life difficult in terms of maintaining European coherence and NATO coherence in response to this. But the notion that there's some credibility to that argument which justified the Russian response, just deserves to be dismissed with a complete horse laugh, as was Russia's claim to, using my own concept of responsibility to protect that I had a lot to do with creating. For Russia to be claiming that it acted because of a responsibility to protect Russian speakers, or in Georgia originally, and then in the Donetsk and the eastern part of Ukraine from genocidal intentions by the Ukrainians. I mean, this is just a joke in very bad taste, and ought not to be taken seriously by anybody. I don't think it is taken very seriously by the world at large. I mean, yes, there were things that were mishandled, by the US in a period, and I referred in passing earlier on to the triumphalism of that earlier Cold War period, and the inability to take Russia very seriously as a player and to accommodate the kind of deep psychological damage that the breakup that the Soviet Union had done. All of that is perfectly true, but none of it begins to excuse for a second Russia's behavior in aggressively invading Ukraine. And I think we just have to keep our bearings on those principles. Otherwise, we've abandoned any claim to decency or credibility in our international responses.
Do you believe that Trump and Witkoff and Kushner and Rubio, perhaps, that they believe it, at least to some extent?
Believe that
Putin
NATO overreached and that Putin was semi-justified? There's obviously an element of that. There's also an element of this, spheres of influence thing, that big guys have the right to throw their weight around and exercise dominance in their own neighborhoods, just as America is now doing on a huge scale and a very unattractive scale to the rest of us in the Western Hemisphere. That is a bit of the subtext here, that we need to take seriously their claims to have their own space and to do their own thing without making moral demands upon them. That is part of the storyline, I think, and that's very troubling, because if that kind of perception takes hold and nobody's interests matter except our own, then God help us in terms of descent into international chaos and anarchy. It's very, very critical that we talk about the decay of the rules-based international order, but there's some rules of international order that are just absolutely indispensable if all of us are to have any kind of sane and safe future. And so you just can't accommodate the kind of nonsense that we're hearing from some sides about the legitimacy of Russia's position. It's totally illegitimate, and it has to be resisted. I mean, whether you can restore the status quo ante completely is another story. I mean, Crimea has gone for all money, and probably Donbass, most of it has gone for all money. But in an ideal world, those wrongs would be righted. That's not going to happen. But sure as hell, you must be able now to hold the line and to give, not just hold the line, but to create an environment in which Ukraine can be confident about its longer-term future. And here, I think, again, the storyline is that ultimately will depend on the Europeans, and ultimately I think the Europeans will hold the line, but it's going to be hard work.
Thank you. Let's turn to some questions from our audience. Sloan, can I ask you to select and ask the first question, please?
Yes. For our first question, you have mentioned faith in multilateralism and cooperation between middle powers. Do you think now is the time for these powers to engage in cooperation to restrain China, given the unreliable American umbrella?
Sorry, Australia-China cooperation, are you saying? Can you just repeat that last bit again?
Yes. Do you think now is the time for these middle powers to engage in cooperation to restrain China, given the unreliable American umbrella?
Cooperation to restrain China, I think that's overstating it a bit. But I mean, the kind of cooperation we've seen, for example, from the Quad, Australia, Japan, and India joining with the United States, not a middle power, but the other three middle powers, joining to just demonstrate, at least optically, a willingness to push back against potential Chinese aggression or overreach. I think that's an important message to give. I think it's very important that the ASEAN countries and the other key players in the East Asian region, South Korea and Japan, obviously, and Australia, do make common cause in terms of making clear that certain forms of behavior by China which are just going to go too far and will demand a reaction. I think it's, as I said before, it's very easy to overstate the threat, and it's not. We're not looking here at a formal alliance, a military alliance of the other players in the region. That's not going to happen, and probably doesn't need to happen. But what does need to happen is a sort of a common response that certain kinds of behavior from China are going to be treated by us as sort of understandable enough as responses by a great power to a perceived century of humiliation, responses by a great power to a felt need to have its own strategic space in the East Asian maritime environment, a recognition that if China were to be behaving in the same way that the United States is behaving, sending submarines up and down, the coastline 12 k's out of San Diego, that there'd be a lot of very unhappy responses in the United States. Recognizing that China has legitimate interests to pursue and some legitimate claims to respect in pursuing those interests, is something that I think all of us need to do. It's not just a matter of crude self-interest in keeping alive our economic relationships. I think most of us in the region would like to see the United States retaining a presence, just as a signal to a significant military presence, as a signal to China that if it were ever to seriously overreach, there would be pushback. But beyond that, I think there's no further need to go. Economically, it is very important that the regional middle powers get their act together cooperatively and reinforce those regional trade and industry and investment mechanisms, RCEP and TPP, complicated alphabet soup here, let's not go into it. But there are these trade and investment agreements and arrangements, which are basically, combinations of powers to assert their own interests in this rather fraught environment. And I think that's the kind of messaging that can usefully be sent to China.
Thank you. The Chinese keep saying that the Quad and AUKUS are aggressive and anti-China and so on and so on. How would you respond to that?
Well, the Quad's not aggressive. It's not a military alliance, but it is, as I've just said, a signal that if there were to be super aggressive behavior by China, they could not expect that to happen without a degree of pushback from some very militarily capable other powers in the region. In terms of AUKUS, I mean, it's a long and complicated story, this Australian US-UK submarine deal. I don't think it poses the slightest threat. The prospect of us eventually, by the 2050s, having 8 nuclear-powered boats in the region would add only very marginal capability to any military alliance against China should it become necessary to mobilize such an alliance. It is a signal which China is happy to identify as such of Australia's willingness to become super enmeshed in the US military machine to the point that gives people like me an extreme sense of discomfort. I mean, I think by spending these eye-watering amounts to acquire this very sophisticated technology, and having so many side deals to accommodate the process along the way in terms of new basing arrangements for the US and Australia, I think we're in the process of putting targets on our back and giving China a cause to be more aggressive towards us than would otherwise be the case, without at the same time making much difference to the military balance. So, I mean, to the extent that China uses that sort of rhetoric against us, it's not doing so with any great sense of conviction, and it's certainly not doing so in any way that should give us, particular anxiety. The whole AUKUS enterprise it's an Australian thing. It's not something that anybody else is very concerned about. But I think and many like me in Australia think it's just completely misconceived. We don't think these boats are ever going to be deliverable given the problems of the US naval industry. Don't think the cost-benefit calculus adds up in any rational way, and all sorts of better ways in which we could be spending those billions of defence dollars. And the third major concern is the implications for our sovereign agency. And there's no way we're getting this without an American expectation that these boats are going to be available at the beck and call of a US president should they ever be required. And that's manifestly not a position that Australia should ever want to be in, having that degree of loss of sovereign agency. And so it's a real live issue in our political space at the moment, but whether we'll get any sanity, I don't care. It's not a provocation that gives any kind of justification for China getting aggressive, and I don't think we should look at it in that light.
Okay, thanks very much. Jack, can you ask the next question?
Yes, so in regards to Prime Minister Carney's comments on the ability of middle powers to shape the new era of international politics, how much leverage do you think middle powers can exert to curb the aggressive actions of superpowers like China, Russia, and the US as a whole?
Do we know who asked that question?
Yes, this was Davis Rayleigh, I believe.
Look, it's obviously, by definition, middle powers don't have, the military might to be able to dissuade even bigger actors like China or the United States, for that matter, from doing their thing. But they can, through cooperative action, play an extremely, positive role through institutions like the United Nations, as we showed in the Cambodia peace process, which was a middle power exercise in mobilizing support through the UN to find creative solutions to intractable, security problems. Middle powers can, and through a collective pushback against the, potential worst excesses of the major powers. I mean, the pushback that the European group of middle powers did to the nonsense that Trump was parroting about Greenland was just a classic example of using the collective weight of their economic capacity to do damage to the United States, the collective political weight of just articulating the total unacceptability of this from countries, noise coming from countries which have traditionally been very loyal and supportive to everything the United States stands for. That just does have an impact. So and middle power, plurilateral, mini-lateral arrangements, the sort of quad thing that I talked about before, they all, and for the ASEAN countries to collectively show a bit more spine, if that's possible, in making clear their unhappiness at some of the overreach that China's been showing in its South China Sea military activity. All of that is capable, I think, of giving pause to great powers doing what otherwise they might be inclined to do. So I don't want to overstate the utility of it as a security counterweight. I mean, the real utility of middle power cooperation is getting on with solving big international global public goods problems, like climate change and all the rest of it. In an environment where perhaps the superpowers have abdicated that responsibility, there's an awful lot can be done on these separate tracks by effective cooperative activity, and certainly in terms of pushing back and supporting free trade and all the rest of it. That's a classic area where again that middle power weight can be felt. So don't overstate it, but it is important, and I think Carney was absolutely on the money in saying this is really about the only hope for the future. If in an environment where the US has had such a cavalier disregard for the rules that have made the system work for so long, and the other Russia's behaving in the same way, and China is indicating a degree of willingness to behave the same way. The middle powers do have a countervailing responsibility to get their act together and can make a difference if they do.
Thank you. Sloan, the next question, please.
Yes, our next question is from Dylan Page. Was the dissolution of American hegemony on an international scale inevitable? Can it be recultivated, or has Trump bred too much distrust for America to be trusted as an international moderator?
Good question. And a lot depends on who the successor of Trump is. An awful lot more damage can be done over the next 3 years, but even more damage can be done if you've got someone like a J.D. Vance for 4 years or 8 years after that. Then, as I said, God help us in terms of restoring any kind of coherent leadership in terms of the values that we've all traditionally associated with the United States. If the midterms go badly for Trump, if he begins to realize that some of the excesses which he's perpetrating are just not going to bear fruit and are going to generate real hurt for the American economy and for American credibility and American capacity to get things done, and the rest of the Trump period involves a sort of a calming down of some of the craziness that we've seen. And if there's a new administration which comes back in with, some of the Obama-esque sort of approaches to the importance of good international citizenship and the importance of recommitting to some kind of decent rules-based order, then I think the situation can be reversed. But it really does all depend. I mean, in the next 2 or 3 years are going to be pretty crucial, and I am still an inherent optimist about the possibility of, because you sort of have to be. You don't get out of bed in the morning if you don't believe in the possibility that what you do might make a difference. And there's still plenty of people that are passionate about restoring these balances. But it's going to be a very close-run thing. It's going to be very, very hair-raising ride the remaining period of the Trump presidency and what happens with that next US election.
But I'm glad to hear a degree of optimism as well.
Only a little, I'm afraid, yeah.
Jack, can you ask the next question, please?
Yes, so this question comes from Brian, and it is, how is Australia going to balance its US and China relations? And then in regards to Prime Minister Albanese, how is he regarded? And Brian goes on to say, you've had remarkable prime ministers in Australia. Do you think he's one of them?
Look, Albanese's a decent character with decent instincts, but by comparison with Hawke and Keating and some of the stars we've had in the past, he is a bit of a plotter. There's no doubt about that. But he's a plotter that has shown a degree of balance and sense in the way in which he's handled Trump and in the way in which he's handled China. I mean, Australians don't do deference. We're not very good at kowtowing. We don't do sucking. There's a national distaste for that, and we've avoided doing that with Trump. And I think it's played into that reality that Trump doesn't particularly respect those who do suck up to him on a Gothic scale. So one way or another, we've managed it, and Albanese's managed it, quite effectively. And we've also managed to restore our relationship with China after going through a very, very rocky and very, very difficult period of unnecessary provocation, I think, of some of the things that were said by the previous government, without going to the other extreme of, bending over so far to China that we're humiliating ourselves in the other direction. I think we've managed to steer a course. I mean, the way I've always put the need to navigate our relationship between the two giants is I've had a mantra of sort of 4 phrases: less America, more self-reliance, more Asia, and more global engagement. Less America speaks for itself. less willingness to assume that the Americans will be there for us, come what may, and much more skepticism about, which is now escalated beyond belief almost with Trump, lots of skepticism about, the positive role that America's playing, without at the same time wanting to walk away completely from the alliance. I don't talk about no America, I talk about less America. And then the companion to that is more self-reliance, recognition that, of course, unless you're going to go down the path of unarmed neutrality, which might work for some countries, wouldn't work for us, you do have to build a defence capability on the basis of other potential adversaries' capability, not their presumed or known intent. And of course, we are going to have to spend more, given the size of the continent that we have to defend, which is absolutely gigantic. But we should do so without believing that the US is absolutely indispensable and that we have to go along with every bit of American adventurism that might occur in order to maintain that alliance commitment. So less America, more self-reliance, more Asia, and that means not only approaching China in a way that recognizes, as our leaders keep saying, the need to compete where we must, but cooperate where we possibly can, and to manage our differences wisely. We've managed to do that, I think, pretty well. We're hugely reliant on China in economic terms. About 26% of our total trade is with China. It's just huge, and it would be absolutely devastating to our economy if that were to collapse overnight in the context of a major conflict. So we've got to navigate this course, but I think we can do it without humiliating ourselves with the kind of kowtows that some people have found necessary, and which are very much against to the extent that there is such a thing as the Australian national spirit or Australian national psyche. I mean, I think there is this absolute distaste for sucking up to anybody, which will stand us in good stead as we continue to navigate these shoals in the period ahead.
Thank you. Sloan, do we have another question?
Yes, from Joshua. How do you see Australia's role in the Indo-Pacific currently, and how has that evolved over the past decade?
Look, Australia's future depends on our geography, not our history. And that's the big lesson that we've learnt over the last generation. AUKUS is a bit of a throwback against that. Here we are back now in the Anglosphere, developing a major relationship with the US and the UK, the traditional great and powerful friends of yesteryear. The truth of the matter is we live in this region. We are absolutely part of it. We have a hugely multicultural population now, a huge Chinese population, 1.4 million out of 27, a huge and growing Indian population, plus people from everywhere else. Nearly half the country is either born overseas or at least one parent born overseas. So we are of the region. We see our security and our economic future as being totally dependent on finding our way in the region, not against it. And that's been something I think the present government has been navigating pretty well. It's been focusing a great deal on recreating some strength in our bilateral relationships right around the Pacific Island and Oceania, of course, Southeast Asia, of course, but also Northeast Asia and India. Very assiduous attention to those personal relationships. It's something that I feel personally very passionately about, the necessity to identify ourselves with our own region. And, while to the extent that some of our values might be a little bit more robust than some of the others in the region, nonetheless to recognise that that's where our place is. One of the most, just a little anecdote here, one of the most moving things that ever happened to me in the whole period that I was Foreign Minister was one of those meetings in Jakarta when we were trying to resolve the Cambodian problem, big international conference. And during a coffee break, I wandered down the corridor looking for a private room to make a phone conversation. And by mistake, I opened the door, and there's half a dozen of my ASEAN foreign ministerial colleagues sitting around the coffee table and talking to themselves. I said, sorry to intrude, didn't mean to intrude, da 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 da. And one of them said to me, yes. A couple of them said to me, no, come on in. You're one of us. You're one of us. And I just don't think that could have happened in preceding generations. I hope it is exactly that kind of sentiment that is now felt towards Australia. We didn't deserve to be so treated for all those decades that we had a white Australia policy, God help us, and we're still being over nostalgic towards our British relationship, our traditional relationship. I think it's just absolutely critical that we recognise that reality and have all our policy and all our sort of political behaviour directed to reinforcing those relationships rather than pushing back against them.
Thanks very much. We are quickly running out of time. Perhaps you have time for a couple of more questions and then we'll let you go. Jack, please.
Yes, so this is from Ben Hughes, and in regards to Japan as a continuing major economic power, and how do you assess it as a major economic power and its present military capability, especially vis-a-vis China?
Well, obviously, Japan has lost its place as the number one Asian player that everybody was talking about for so many decades, but it's still a very, very formidable economic player, and it really matters. And the health of the Japanese economy and the health of Japanese demography and everything else that's in issue at the moment is very important to the future of the region. I think it's probably inevitable that we've seen a hardening of Japanese positions in terms of its traditional role of not wanting to be seen as a potentially active defence player, just purely focused on self-defence. It's probably inevitable given the rise of China and given the fact that there are unresolved historical grievances of still a very deep emotional kind running in China against Japan, and given there's a couple of unresolved territorial issues, admittedly for inconsequential bits of territory, but nonetheless emotionally, quite troubling because both sides are not wanting to give way. It's probably inevitable that under those circumstances we would see, some move by Japan to acquire a more formidable military capability with a more obviously not just self-defense role, but active role in the event that it was ever faced under serious threat. What troubles me a little bit is the beginnings of talk again about Japan acquiring its own nuclear weapons capability. This is again one of the legacies, God help us, of the Trump administration because of this perception that allies are more encumbrances than assets. I mean, allies that previously wouldn't have given a second's thought to acquiring a nuclear capability are now beginning to do so. Korea particularly, unhappily, is talking that talk, but it's even beginning a little bit in Japan. I don't think it will ever happen in Japan because the community sentiment post-Hiroshima, Nagasaki is so obviously anti-nuclear weapons, but nonetheless, it's troubling, and I think it's important that the line be held against going that far. But Japan remains an incredibly important player. And as I said in the context of the Quad earlier on, and it's just the sheer optics of Japan having a formidable military capability and being willing to engage in cooperative activity with other similar powers in the region does demonstrate to the Chinese that there would be risks involved were it to ever get super aggressive in the region and overdo the territorial aggression. So no, Japan's a big player. I mean, it worries me that the left in Japanese politics has been so decimated, and that all the political argument seems to be on variations on the right of varying degrees of aggressiveness and cantankerousness, but they'll sort that out. And the relationship between Australia and Japan is very sound, very solid, and Japan continues to play a very important role. What is encouraging, I think, in particular, is that Japan and South Korea seem to be working very assiduously now to mend their traditional hostile relationship, recognising again the utility in the absence of anyone having any sense of reliance on the United States anymore. They're sensing the utility of being seen by China and North Korea, by the way, to have a united front. So Japan continues to be an extremely important player, and we all recognise that.
Thanks very much. And the final question to Sloan, please.
Yes, this is from Randy Lieberman. Do you think there's a possibility that China has interest in gaining Far Eastern Russian territory?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's interesting in a sense because China talks so often about redressing the century of humiliation and recovering the territory that was lost during that sort of century, but it never talks about the territory that it lost in the Far East, which was really quite substantial, and it's now lifelong. There's always going to be a degree of tension with Russia. The notion that they're sort of irredeemably best buddies forever has not been the history of the relationship between the two countries, and it may not be the future, but it is pretty much the present. And I think there's no real prospect at all. Xi just doesn't talk about this. Nobody that I'm aware of has talked about the Russian Far East territories and China's potential claim to it. Nobody has talked that language for ages, and in the present environment, I just don't see that as one of the things anybody needs to worry about. There's enough else to worry about as we've described, but I don't think that's one of the issues that it's going to be up there.
Thank you very much. Before we let you go, finally, we haven't really mentioned Iran or the Board for Peace and the Gaza conflict at all. A few words. Do you think there will be an attack, there will be war with Iran? Because according to Trump, an armada of a very impressive naval armada has almost arrived there. How do you evaluate the situation right now?
I mean, the whole Iran story the Iran nuclear story is really a horror one because it was so avoidable. I mean, what Trump did in his first administration, tearing up that hard negotiated joint comprehensive plan of settlement, it wasn't perfect, but it was amply sufficient to keep quiescent any possibility that Iran would actually, move from rhetoric to reality in terms of its nuclear armaments. I still think there's pretty zero prospect of Iran moving in that direction, and the need accordingly for the United States to sort of decimate the country militarily just to solve the nuclear problem is a complete misapprehension of what's necessary, and is bound to be unhappy in its implication. I mean, it doesn't seem to be any part of the current build-up of military capability against Iran despite some of the rhetoric when the worst of the repression was occurring a couple of weeks ago. Democracy, human rights doesn't seem to be part of Trump's repertoire now. It just seems to be solely about the nuclear issue and the potential missile threat to Israel and others. But I mean, if we haven't learnt by now that there's the dangers of sort of pursuing regime change without thinking through the capacity of what the hell you do afterwards to restore stability and sanity in the country. I mean, Iran is a country of 90 million people, and you're not going to reduce it to submission by an airborne attack. Boots on the ground seems an impossibly insane thing to contemplate. And I think the whole thing is just you can decapitate possibly, with the kind of intelligence that support that US has had clearly from Israel in the past. You might be able to decapitate the theocratic leadership, but you've got formidable other institutional forces still in place with the Revolutionary Guards and others, and just how this thing would work itself out it's just almost impossible to imagine. So, I'm one of those. I'm profoundly sympathetic to the Iranian people, profoundly sympathetic to the human rights and democracy, struggle and tensions that are going on there. Profoundly uncomfortable with the theocracy. But the notion that somehow we can bomb our way into restoration of sanity in Iran is just complete misapprehension. I think would America be buying itself another Iraq without any redeeming possibility of decency at the end of the trail. In terms of the border peace, I mean, I'm sorry, I just regard this as another Trump vanity project of zero utility. It's not. It doesn't even make reference to the UN Security Council resolution that formally authorized its creation. Pays no regard at all to the role of the United Nations. It's obviously set up to undermine the UN in terms of its longer-term aspirations. Donald Trump as sort of president in perpetuity of the body is a joke in bad taste. The army of waifs and strays and lightweights and autocrats that have signed up for it so far don't give any confidence that would have any credibility. I mean, had this been a vehicle narrow in its scope, properly constructed in terms of its governance, to implement a Gaza reconstruction program and to mobilize Middle Eastern, funds in particular for that purpose, I'd be cheering it on. But it's impossible to greet with anything other than extreme skepticism this particular piece of Trumpian nonsense. And to have, people like Tony Blair, coming out of retirement to purport to play a role. I mean, I'm on record describing Tony Blair's role as Middle East envoy as being about as useful as an ashtray on a motorbike. And I'm afraid I can't see it being any greater a contribution in this context than it was in previous ones. It's just a tragedy that the whole Israel-Palestine thing has unfolded the way it has. And it's one of the great unresolved problems of our time, and unfortunately it looked like remaining so.
And
so on that unhappy note,
yes.
we'll wave you goodbye.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to have you with us. You gave us an awful lot of food for thought. Your insights were very helpful indeed. I think we had a very wide tour across the entire world, at least the most pressing global conflicts we talked about. We neglected Latin America a little bit and Venezuela, but we'll do that next time you are on. I hope it will not be the last time we will be able to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series. Gareth Evans, has been a great pleasure. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for all the information you gave to us. And thanks a lot. I would also like...
Thank you, Klaus.
I would also
My pleasure. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. I would also like to thank our audience. They have stayed with us to the bitter end, and I would like to alert you to the fact that the next Krasno event is already next Thursday, and here we will talk about Strobe Talbot, the Clinton administration, the Afghanistan war, the Soviet Union persecuted, and ask the question whether the West, as Gareth already indicated, whether the West did miss an opportunity to bring Russia into the community of nations in a more constructive way than was done. So that is next week, next Thursday, 5 p.m. actually. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Gareth Evans, again for being so helpful to us today. Goodbye.
Thank you.